Welcome, everybody, to our first, after the keynote session. I shouldn't have started that way. To session 2B on day 2 of Generation Analogs. This session features green identities and all of its, nebulousness and interest. So I'm just going to start introducing folks in the order of the program. So up first is Cody Walizer on slicing the color pie. Welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate it. I'm just in the midst of sharing my screen here. I'm hoping everybody can see that well. I want to quickly say thanks to everybody at Analog Game Studies for having me. It's been a great conference so far, and I'm really excited for this panel. The abstracts got me extremely excited and also extremely, I wouldn't say nervous, but just a lot of anticipation about being here. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Additionally, you can follow along on our agenda at the bottom. There are basically three things that I'm going to talk about in this presentation today. The first one is, what is the color pie? The second one is the idea of green as Eastern in Magic the Gathering. And then the third thing that I'm going to talk about is sort of the paradigmatic conclusion of this presentation, which is Asia as method. I briefly wanted to introduce myself as well. My name is Cody Walizer. I'm an assistant teaching professor of rhetoric and technology at the University of Colorado Boulder. And typically, my research profile is about the meaning of games and sports. And so I try as a rhetorician to grasp of those types of things through a conversation. And typically that conversation takes on the form of a decolonial framework and trying to understand how we might sort of break down the typical structures or the typical discursive formations that take place when we're talking about games. I also wanted to position myself. I am a practicing Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. I am also Shin Nikkei. I'm Asian American, Japanese American, technically Sansei or third generation. And so any of those identity positions and more might kind of come up in this presentation or come out. I also wanted to provide my email. I also also wanted to say thank you for adding me back onto the Discord because I got locked out. So I'll I'll be back on there and participating in the conversation. So let's go ahead and get started. The first question that we need to answer today is, what is the color pie? And luckily, I have my mono green commander Jugon, as you can see in the background and on these slides, here to guide me through this conversation. And so I'll hope you'll indulge my obsession there. Um, the color pie is the mechanical character and narrative quality of the game Magic the Gathering. And actually, you can see the color pie itself on the back of a Magic the Gathering card. You see those 5 dots there, resembling each color of Magic the Gathering. And when you would perhaps tap a Magic the Gathering card, let's say on an interface like Magic the Gathering Arena, this is what you would see pop up, a literal color wheel is a different kind of archetype or a different philosophy in relation to magic. And how does that philosophy actually play out? How does it get represented in a broad variety of ways? And I have to give all of my friends who are still waking up here a little warning. This next slide is very bright. I would at least want that warning if I were on Pacific time here. And so you can see how this kind of color pie or color wheel gets represented in a couple of different ways. On the left-hand side is the Wizard of Barge's new t-shirt. He just had a big collaboration with Magic the Gathering where they released a whole deck. And as it says, you should choose your color wisely or suffer defeat. And you can see the two kind of archetypal words that are associated with green on the left-hand side are life and nature. On the right-hand side is a really cool diagram by Duncan Sabian, who has an entire article. It's a really long and really cool article on the color wheel and the relationships here. And so how does it characterize green? It characterizes green as harmony through acceptance. On the sort of spectrum of nature or nurture, green is nature. On the sort of spectrum of take it or leave it, green is leave it. And it relates to other colors through things like community and authenticity. And so, to paraphrase Duncan Sabian's article, green is the color of Taoism. And a world without green is a world without the qualities that people derive from Zen Buddhism. Now, these things are really important because of the way in which these colors actually work in Magic the Gathering. What magic is and what it means is that you are supposed to be, you, the player, are supposed to be a planeswalker who is traveling to different lands, and each color has its own sort of archetypal land. Plains for white, islands for blue, swamps for black, mountains for red, and forests for green. And you are a sort of magic user, a mage, a planeswalker who is gathering the mana of that place and sort of channeling it into a magical spell or effect. And why this is so important now in 2026 is because of my first contention, which is that Magic the Gathering has become a kind of platform. And I mean platform in the way that Nick Cernicek articulates it in his book, Platform Capitalism. So, no, I'm not saying that Magic has become Google, but I am saying that Magic has become like Google in the sense that it is now used to facilitate value creating interactions between external producers and consumers. And the question would maybe be, who are those external producers? Well, they are IP holders. Yes, if you are not aware, as of about 2020, Magic the Gathering has turned to something called Universes Beyond, where outside IPs are now represented in Magic. More on that in just a second. It is also important to talk about Magic the Gathering in terms.
Technology. Okay, give him a second to come back. Apologies on their behalf. Meanwhile, Fernando, you have your hand up. Is there a reason, or do you have a question? You can type it in chat. Well, if this is our major snafu for the conference, great, I'll take it. Knocking on wood, I have a candle lit for, the technology gods. It's all good.
I felt we were kind of due, for
Yeah,
a little
it's
snafu.
your fault.
Yes.
Okay. Now the question is the sunk cost fallacy of how long wait. Um, I think, let me ping him on. Ping him on other channels. I sense a full system crash. response on Discord.
I think he said he got locked out of the Discord and hadn't been
Yeah, he
in.
added a secondary account,
Oh, I see.
which is I think the name is Capsule. Um, which means that he's probably fully crashed. Okay, I'm going to make the executive decision to move on. I'll give him one more minute, and then if he doesn't come back, I think we'll just move on, and then we will circle back to allow him to finish his talk. We are done. Nope, he returned.
My goodness, what a time for the internet to go out.
Yeah, you came back though, which is great.
I'm here and I'm still ready to go. I will try not to take more time.
Oh, no worries, no worries.
Than the full 15 here.
We totally understand. Okay, if you've all watched The Sheep Detectives, everyone forget that there was a break.
The editor will handle that in post, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Sorry about that, and thanks for your patience. What I was just saying is that this is sort of how that platforming can be represented, right? We see Shang-Chi, this fundamentally Asian character, being represented by the color green, and here having this outside intellectual problem. What does this really mean, and where am I drawing this research and this critique from? Ultimately, we have to turn to the idea of green as Eastern, which is not something that I made up, but is something that comes up from Mark Rosewater himself, who is the lead designer of Magic the Gathering. And Mark has a really interesting practice. He records a podcast on his drive to work, and he has thousands and thousands of episodes talking about how they come up with the different features of the game. On episode 1086, he is talking about the design of Tarkir, which is an Asian plane. It is sort of this pan-Asian plane that is represented by Mongolia and Cambodia and all the way to indigenous cultures like the Ainu in Hokkaido. And what he is talking about here is the relationship between the colors green, blue, and black. And blue and black, as you saw before, are sort of the enemy colors of green. And so how does green stand up to those enemy colors? I'm glad I see my colleague who's going to be talking about Magic later, Mark, nodding along with me. So it's good. I knew we would have some synergy here, but I'm glad to see that's taking place. The quotations here are really interesting from Mark Rosewater. He says, green of the five colors is the philosophy that's kind of most like Eastern philosophy, sort of like be one with the world and understand the world. He says that green has a sort of a sense of spirituality to it, the idea of respecting all those that exist and understanding them, and that there's a lot of stuff that goes on in green that is sort of not natural in the way that the Western Hemisphere operates. And that last piece, especially in terms of how Magic the Gathering has become a platform, I find to be really interesting because Black Panther is not a black card. Black Panther is actually, and Wakanda as a whole, is represented by green. So very clearly there's something non-Western happening in this color. And as I was seeing all of that develop, I was like, okay, hold on a second. This is calling me to a couple of pieces of literature that on the left-hand side, Asia as Method, have really animated much of my scholarly program anyway. And on the right-hand side has become kind of a new muse for me. Christopher Patterson and Tara Fickle's edited collection, of which Ed's essay, Gaming While Asian, is the first research question. And again, just rushing a little bit because we had that technical difficulty here. How can we productively read green as Eastern in Magic the Gathering without falling into that Orientalist trap of a binary opposition between the East and West? In other words, what would it mean to read green as Asia? And this is where we arrive to a conversation with Asia as Method. Kwansing Chen, I think, articulates the position of Asia as Method as a really important thing for Asia. And so as a diasporic scholar myself, as somebody who is firmly positioned in Asian America. How can I see Asia as a product of history and realize that it has been an active participant in the historical process? And how can I follow that call to action of using or seeing Asia as this emotional signifier, as this source of regional integration, stability, and solidarity? And ultimately, that made me think of this question that emerges from Made in Asia/America, which is how do we make arguments about games that expose imperial networks and build on these anti-racist projects without simply demanding more representation from, obviously, companies that are implicated in networks of empire and racialization themselves. And so this is where I really make my argument. My second contention is that too often, Asian influence is read as Western capture. Magic didn't engulf or obliterate Taoism or Buddhism. How could it? Instead, Asia should be seen as a large part of what has made magic/fantasy/gaming what it is. And I think as far as Magic as a platform goes, there's no better example than the best-selling Magic set of all time, which is Final Fantasy, right? Which is the idea that Square Enix, this large multinational corporation, all right. There are three discourses that I believe productively emerge from this, and we can trace them through the history of Magic. The first is green as Taoist, as Duncan Sabian pointed us to. And actually, this is the easiest one to trace because we go back to something like Portal 3 Kingdoms, and we have cards literally called Taoist Mystic and Taoist Hermit. This is more modernly represented by Zhang Yangyu, who is sort of the one with nature planeswalker from the plane of Shangmeng, for example. And so the capacious discourse that emerges here is that if we read green as Asia, if we instead of saying, oh, Asia has been territorialized as green, and instead we say that Asia has influenced what green is, we would see that Asia has influenced green to think of itself as being one with nature. Additionally, we can draw real historical parallels to Confucianism because Confucius is quoted or represented on multiple different cards. And here we see green in the form of 3 visits, and then the relationship between green and other colors, its enemy color in terms of black, right? How would it be to sort of not accept your place in your community or accept your role in society, instead go against that? When you give offense to heaven, to whom can you pray? And then to white, where it has this sort of representation of community, living through the high virtues that Confucianism espouses. The capacious discourse that is most directly related to my identity, that you see sort of taking place behind me and on these different slides here, is the one represented by Kamigawa, which is both Shintoism and Buddhism being represented in Magic the Gathering. And this discourse is basically green as enlightenment, green as seeking enlightenment, seeking to be enlightened, seeking to become harmonious with the rest of the world. And so my argument here is that reading green as Asia in this way sort of breaks down the color pie. It demonstrates that Asian influence has always existed in Magic the Gathering. And maybe we could say, if we were to read something like Made in Asia/America as critically as possible, has always existed in gaming. So how do we answer that research question? For me, it's radical possibility of rejecting Western engulfment while also embracing play as its own form of cultural production and negotiation. So in other words, what I'm arguing is to play more green. What would it mean to play more green? It might mean to join Jugon and I in defending the temple, but it also might mean playing more capaciously as accepting, playing more one with nature, playing more enlightened. And certainly there were some things there that I scrambled over just to make sure that we're staying on track and on time. But I appreciate all of your time, and I'm looking forward to a really great conversation. Thanks for bearing with me, all.
Not a problem. Thank you for trying to stay on time. The time paladin in me is very happy with that. And Cody, I think this work might hopefully will become a publication, and then we can just read all about it later. Okay, up next is Yuri Morroni on Alien Skin and playing Otherness. And I am running Yuri's slide. So let me do that real quick. And then Yuri, you just have to tell me when to advance slides. For the Gen Xers and older folks out there, you can also make a little boom sound.
All right. May I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so thank you all for the presence and the opportunity of being here. My name is Yuri Morroni. I am a master's student in design in Santa Catarina, Brazil. So you guys may expect a thick accent and some weird pronunciation, so bear with me. And it's kind of hard to sound smart in another language, so I'll try. And this is Alien Skin playing Otherness and Queerness in tabletop games. Next. So, green as other. Green skin has long been associated with the other. Fairies, elves, spirits, witches, and demons all belong to a strange world between the natural and the supernatural. And by the 19th century, they give rise to aliens. However, aliens are distinct from their mythological predecessors because their existence derives from science, created by evolutionary processes like humans, and therefore frequently discussed as the other of the human. Next, please. Now, other as queer. Otherness understood as the discursive process through which a dominant in-group constructs a dominated out-group by stigmatizing perceived differences, has queerness as one of its major figures. Queerness, defined by queer scholars Ruberg and Shaw, is the desire to live life otherwise, by questioning and living outside of normative boundaries. Next, please. And queer as alien. In heteronormative societies, queerness is often seen as alien, and in parallel, science fiction aliens can likewise be read as queer. Next. This presentation builds on the paradigm of queer game studies, which interrogates and refigures the systems that structure games in order to uncover their queer potential. Queer game studies question norms and conventions about how games are expected to function, including practices of play and systemic disruptions. Next, please. So the question here, drawing on the analogy of aliens as queer, the analysis turns to tabletop games in which players inhabit alien bodies to examine how gameplay enables the performances of alien alterity. In other words, how is playing as an alien different from playing as a human? Next, please. So at the moment, there are almost 700 games under the Alien family tag on Board Game Geek. Next, please. And these are the games that I chose to analyze. So given that communication with aliens has consistently been a central theme in science fiction, representing the possibility of bridging the distance between humans and the other through mutual recognition, this study analyzes 4 games whose core premises centers on players assuming the role of aliens communicating with humans. So, Signal, A Message from the Stars, First Contact, and Visitor in Blackwood Grove. Next, please. Each game was analyzed individually through Jesse Shell's tetrad, examining how alien roles were constructed across mechanics, story, aesthetics, and technology, in contrast to human roles, in order to identify patterns and divergences. Next. So beginning with aesthetics, regarding the aesthetic element, each game portrays the alien role differently. Signal, for example, features specific illustrations for the alien player, whereas Visitor in Black Grove does not depict the alien creature at all. As a common pattern, none of the games present the alien character with a human appearance, emphasizing their non-human nature. In the next slide, we may see some of the illustrations. So some are from the game box, some are from the rulebook. And now the next slide, please. As for the story element found in the rulebooks, each game presents a different scenario. In Message from the Stars, humans make the first contact, while in Signal, the aliens arrive on Earth. A shared pattern in both First Contact and Visitor in Blackwood Grove is the aliens' reliance on human help. Next, please. In terms of technology, aliens and humans share most core components. Notably, all the games utilize screens or card stands to keep the aliens' information secret. On the next slide, we may see some of the components. Okay, next, please. Regarding mechanics, all the games are asymmetric. The alien player possesses secret information and must guide the humans to deduce it. In some games, the mechanics are more similar between players, as seen in A Message from the Stars. In contrast, in games like Signal, players operate under relatively different rules and gameplay. Next, please. In conclusion, what this analysis reveals is that these tabletop games don't just represent the alien, they structurally construct alterity. Through asymmetric mechanics and the physical barriers of technology, like screens, the game design literally separates the alien player from the humans. By stepping into asymmetric, non-human roles, these games allow players to temporarily inhabit, perform, and negotiate what it means to exist outside of normative boundaries. For future works, it could expand this framework to analyze other tabletop genres, such as hidden role, to explore how different mechanical systems perform alien alterity beyond communication. The next slide are my references, and that's basically it. Obrigado. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Glad that all worked out. Amazing. Awesome. Okay. Let me put some claps on the screen here. Okay. Up next is Mark Hines on Aragorn the Divider.
Howdy, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen, get us moved over. I want to offer a massive thanks, as always, to the Generation Analog Game Studies team. It's been one of the pleasures of my scholarly life being here year after year. And to those who are curious about game studies, let me say that when I was first also curious about game studies, this was the warmest and most welcoming community that I could have found. And it's the reason that I still keep coming back, right? But sentiment aside, let me get into the presentation. This is all part of my dissertation work, which examines fantasy games' responses to the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 and how reading fantastic racial groups like orcs, dwarves, and elves informs and constitutes our understanding of race in this world. I want to offer a brief content warning before I get into the meat of the presentation that I'll be discussing racism, sexism, and online harassment on Reddit. I here am going to examine some community responses to the race bending of major characters in the Magic the Gathering set, Tales of Middle-earth. In particular, I'm analyzing the discourse of a prominent libertarian or right-wing subreddit, r/free magic. I analyze subscribers to this subreddit are often those who have been banned from more mainline subreddits, and I want to dub this problematic antisocial phenomenon a deviant refuge, a term I am in great debt to the work of Kishana Gray. I'll begin with some background on Tolkien, Magic the Gathering, and online discourses concerning fantasy media before examining the results of my data scraping of the r/free magic subreddit. Tales of Middle-earth was released on June 23rd, 2023. Cards feature creatures, events, and characters from Middle-earth, such as Last March of the Ents, Cast into the Fire, and Isildur's Fateful Strike. Other than the commercial success of the set, it generated controversy for its portrayal of Aragorn, Éowyn, and Theoden as having dark skin. This shouldn't be surprising to any of the folks here. Much history of speculative genres in games is characterized by an overwhelming maleness and whiteness. Indeed, the question of Tolkien's world-building logic and to whom Middle-earth belongs is a persistent scholarly and cultural question. An article written by critical race theorist Charles W. Mills, discovered only a couple years ago, though likely written in the 1980s, draws upon the work of Frantz Fanon, titling a political analysis of the racial hierarchy of The Lord of the Rings as, quote, the wretched of Middle-earth, an Orcish manifesto, end quote. In it, Mills writes that Tolkien's writings, despite occurring in a fantasy world, draw upon and reiterate European racial myths. Mills continues his analysis by attempting to demonstrate concrete links between the races of Middle-earth and their analogs in our own worlds, a connection which I am uninterested in pursuing. In contrast, I consider the relationship between fantastic racial groups and racial groups in our own world as a process of dynamic semiosis, which has been disrupted since the inclusion of heroic dark-skinned characters. In my framework, representations do not have to be statically interpreted, such as green or dark-skinned orcs being equivalent to black people or indigenous people. Rather, I recognize semiosis as an ongoing process through which certain kinds of assemblages of humanness and otherness might be ambiguously alluded to through visuality or procedural rhetoric. Race bending as a practice has existed for as long as we have had media and an understanding of race, often resulting in whitewashing just as much as inclusive representations. Especially following whitewashing controversies in the live-action Avatar or Ghost in the Shell and race-bending controversies in Marvel and Star Wars, fans often read race-bending as an inherently political practice. Even more relevant is the inclusion of actors of color in Amazon's The Ring of Power as dwarves, men, hobbits, and elves, alongside sympathetic portrayals of orcs, a notable shift from Peter Jackson's iconic depictions in the films. Other scholars have also pointed out the politicization of race bending as due to the assumed whiteness of fans themselves. Mel Stanfield points out there is a need for fan studies to name whiteness as it functions in fandom and interrogate its workings, a dynamic at play in subreddits wherein the author and reader are assumed to be white. Pandey assists by analyzing the fraught, complicated relationship with many fans and scholars have to the notion of authenticity in representation, authenticity becoming a social currency filtered through the lenses of race, gender, and other markers of identity. As an intellectual property, The Lord of the Rings is particularly ripe for the racist, sexist discourse which pervades gaming cultures. Emma Vossen persuasively compares the rhetoric of Tolkien's Inklings Literary Club to that of contemporary men's rights activists and gamergaters to show that an essentialist logic of exclusion runs historically and culturally deep in fantasy and science fiction circles. As Vossen points out, to the old guard of gaming, the supposed intrusion of women and people of color, often assumed to be inexperienced or green into gaming spaces, is political in the sense that it is the result of a nefarious agenda as opposed to a genuine interest in hobby games. Similarly, the inclusion of a dark-skinned character is not seen as a thoughtful representational shift, but rather interpreted as forced diversity, which limits the identification of the assumed white gamer to their hobby. Along the same lines, the race bending of characters also disrupts network privilege. In Magic, Aaron Trammell's term for social gatekeeping on racial, gendered, and socioeconomic grounds. Race bending characters challenges the imagined homogeneity of the network, not only proving that Black, queer, disabled, and women gamers already exist and are active participants in the community, but also that many white male gamers disagree with the historic privileged exclusionary logics both in and out of fantasy worlds. I'll now turn towards fan responses to Aragorn's race bending in particular in this reactionary subreddit. r/free magic cultivates a right-wing or libertarian ethos, though sometimes buried under several layers of irony in discourses of persecution and absolutist free speech. It is crucial to keep in mind that, as Masanari has shown, Reddit's design principles and discursive framing allow relative ease in forming and joining anti-feminist and anti-social justice warrior communities. For this reason, and inspired by Heslop and Berg's work on Discord servers and Austin Anderson's work on homebrewing subreddits, I utilized Brock's critical technoculture discourse analysis, an approach which attends to both the actual discourse as well as how platform logics interact with such discourses. I read Reddit's public rhetorics, policies, and interfaces in conjunction with the discourse and platform logics of its users, finding interesting tensions therein. As Kashana Gray has discussed, The anonymity of Reddit can contribute to disinhibition, resulting in deviant behavior on the web. However, as Gray later notes, this behavior, such as racial slurs and harassment, is also normative within white supremacy, and it also is the presence of blackness that then becomes deviant to the deviant behavior of whiteness. In both cases, r/free magic represents a kind of confrontational deviance, expressing deviant behavior in response to the presence of blackness in a space supposed to belong to whiteness. In these pseudo-anonymous spaces, outrage can be a way to assert authority and control over intellectual properties into which the fan has vested a personal stake. The race bending of Tales of Middle-earth has forced these communities to consider what is authentically Tolkien, as well as who gets to be an authentic fan of Lord of the Rings, both of which subtly re-territorialize the white man as the essential fan and gamer. As contrasted with other subreddits, which often have rules about what can and cannot be posted, r/free magic's first two rules outline its commitment to a libertarian open discourse. Say anything you want and meme anything you want. The sub was originally created as a refuge for those who were banned from more mainline Magic the Gathering subreddits. Although you won't necessarily find avowed white supremacy and advocacy for violence in r/free magic, the subreddit fosters identity grievances and white consciousness around popular culture. Following Kashana Gray's work, I want to name this community and others like it a deviant refuge. Importantly, Gray notes that unequal power structures can result in powerful moments of deviant opposition which is often labeled deviant by powerful entities. Conversely, the community I examine here, in response to a powerful entity portraying a race-bent character, engages in another kind of deviant behavior, one which reaffirms problematic ideals of whiteness and masculinity rooted in antisocial behavior. By defining themselves in opposition to the supposedly liberal or woke content moderation which originally resulted in them being banned, members of deviant refuges can channel their collective outrage about their hobby into a more general sense of persecution. In this way, content moderation of one group might lead to the congregation of antisocial, racist, sexist, transphobic, etc. behavior in another community. Because Reddit often relies on users policing one another for content moderation, deviant refuges act like a community for edgy posts. In fact, many posts upon which I utilize data analysis tools began as braggadocious notifications that the users had been banned from other subreddits. Congrats. By housing its content within individual subreddit communities, Reddit tends to emphasize a libertarian logic of self-determination, wherein the user, rather than an algorithm or a company, is responsible for the content being seen. In the fall of 2020, I searched r/free magic for threads using the search term Aragorn, and I then scraped the resulting 244 threads. We can tell a few things simply by scraping the submission titles and their corresponding threads. The average submission in this data group generated 93 comments, which is over 3 times the average for overall submissions. The comment discrepancy demonstrates the potent controversy generated by race-bending Aragorn. Referring to the representation of Aragorn in Tales of Middle-earth remained a simple way to generate engagement in this subreddit. The data pulled from these threads resulted in about 280,000 tokens. I then used AntConc, which is a concordance tool, meaning that it specializes in finding text and relating that text to other text. After running the word racist through the program, I saw that there were 430 instances of the word racist being used in the dataset. The co-locate tool checks to see the words which surround racist, and it gives me the frequency around which those words appear. Despite the word sexist having a low frequency in the dataset, it is relatively likely to appear near the word racist. The same is true for words like homophobic, bigoted, and Nazi, which despite being outliers in terms of their raw frequency, pop up together in a statistically unlikely way. This particular search tells us that users in r/free magic tended to keep the discussion of Aragorn particularly about race. However, some users drew the word racist alongside other terms about hate and discrimination in order to make larger assertions about Magic the Gathering's transition toward more inclusive storytelling and representation. This layering of isms is common amongst anti-woke or anti-SJW writers. For those users, race-bending a character is never just about that particular instance, but is instead indicative of broader trends which are supposedly anti-male, anti-white, and so on. In order to reiterate the degree to which this question of representation is also a question of shared humanity, I uploaded my corpus to Orange in order to produce a word cloud of common terms. Clearly, the character of Aragorn, race, and humanity were at the forefront of these discussions. Users of r/free magic are debating Tolkien's Middle-earth in terms common to our contemporary culture debates over diversity and inclusivity. Many of these users, such as my example, will insist that representing Aragorn as black has made Middle-earth political, but the instinct to fall back upon popular understandings of race demonstrates the always already racedness of Tolkien's vision. This comment aligns with others across several threads, which posits Wizards of the Coast as attacking straight white men. Indeed, The Lord of the Rings is often described as a cultural property of straight white men, which has been stolen from its owners. Stolen. Alongside the assertion that Lord of the Rings has been made political by race bending, several users of r/free magic strategically utilize a colorblind or race-neutral standpoint to downplay the group's racism. These defenses ignore the historical disparity in racial depictions, especially in fantasy games. Ignoring this discrepancy allows users on the forum to act as though white people are, in reality, under attack by media representations, and they struggle to attend to material histories and contemporary realities of political representation and persecution. The anti-fans of free magic speak back to the set in other ways. Aragorn the Uniter is commonly photoshopped or altered by members of r/free magic in order to portray Aragorn as white, reinforcing both the identitarian politics and do-it-yourself approach typical to the old guard of hobby cultures. The image here depicts Aragorn as white with the outline of a beard. They used an artificial intelligence generator to produce the image, simply swapping out the image as published from Wizards of the Coast. This ability, in combination with the common magic practice of proxying cards for other versions, demonstrates how oppositional readings within a network can coalesce to reaffirm hegemonic identity while simultaneously claiming to be an outsider in a hobby group. Despite the racist dynamic evinced by the race bending here, I argue that race bending alone does not manifestly change the strategies of interpreting the racial politics of Middle-earth. Excuse me. Although an aspect of visual difference is meaningfully changed through race bending, the procedural, rule-based, metaphysical order of Middle-earth remains unchallenged. The racial structure of Middle-earth, wherein racial groups are transcendentally endowed with essentialist characteristics, remains in place despite visual representation. We can see how this structure becomes exported beyond immediate visuality, as a fan-made card appropriated the amass orcs mechanic from Tales of Middle-earth in order to make a racist point about the anti-Semitic Great Replacement theory. Notice that the card's artist is listed as George Soros. Relatedly, a profile of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni notes the commonality of this interpretation across linguistic and cultural lines, that the Middle-earth representation is valuable not for specific visuality, but because of the metaphysical order of the world, that each race has its place. While I pass over my sources, I had a lot of help on this one, and especially from Drs. Austin Anderson and P.B. Berg. The addition of black and brown skin in the depictions of the free peoples of Middle-earth, though challenging to normative whiteness, does not alleviate the essentialist readings of The Lord of the Rings. Rather, the incorporation of black and brown folks in such beliefs and representations, perhaps ironically, is a necessity in perpetuating white hegemony, a project which requires continual redefinition in the changing midst of ideas about diversity and inclusivity. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Great. All right, everyone. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Yeah. To round out the panel is our Diamond Beverly-Porter and Marlene Gaynair talking about the kitchen table as archive. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share our screen. Whoop. Okay, well, hi y'all, happy to be here. My name is Diamond Beverly-Porter. I'm an assistant professor of games, immersive and interactive technologies, and this is a joint work with Marlene Gaynair, assistant professor of history, and we're both from Washington State University. So our presentation, The Kitchen Table as Archive, Black Women, Spades, and Informal Game Pedagogies, really argues that Spades is not simply a card game or even just a leisurely activity, right, but a form of cultural infrastructure through which Black communities sustain collective life. So in this presentation, we're really going to focus on Black women's experiences of Spades. So specifically, we're going to examine the kitchen table as this kind of site of pedagogy, cultural transmission, and really where things like strategy and banter, storytelling all kind of enmesh to become the space of belonging. And as we go throughout this work, you'll see that we reference a lot of Carrie Mae Weems' The Kitchen Table series, and we utilize this to understand the kitchen table as this kind of critical site for Black social life. So thinking about how meaning and the ways that we interact are continuously produced and performed, and of course, in our case, through the practice of play. And throughout this talk, of course, we'll talk about things like comparative play, network gatekeeping theory, design bleed, fugitive theory, game studies, all of that good stuff to really interrogate Spades and how Black women interact with the game itself. Marlene, are you there?
You're muted.
Oh my goodness. Hello? Check, check, check.
Hello.
1, 2. All right. What belongs in the kitchen? Who belongs in the kitchen? What happens in the kitchen? Historically, the idea of women in this domestic space is based on gendered roles that have developed over space and time in certain Western societies, that women should maintain the household as men work and exist in the public space. We see this develop during the industrial age, the revolution. But of course, it's also affected by race and class, since in many other contexts, men and women labored and engaged in activities outside and away from the home. For the United States, this cult of womanhood or domesticity during the Victorian age implied that women's natural place was in the home, to nurture, to take care of the family, to remain pure and submissive, to stay in her place. This was a luxury for the middle class, the upper class, white families who stayed home and lived on one income, which was not possible for the majority of us. In Black American culture, the kitchen, more specifically the table, carried dual significance, operating as more than a place to eat, but also as an archive, a stage, a sacred space of autonomy and cultural preservation, of resistance. When the kitchen became a communal space, the kitchen table is a play service and infrastructure, informal institution of game learning, where play became a method of teaching, archiving, and sustaining and exchanging cultural knowledge. By examining the card game we know as Spades through the experiences of Black women, we reveal how analog games operate as social infrastructures, preserving memories, cultivating belonging, and transmitting forms of expertise often overlooked within traditional game studies and their frameworks. Black women's role at the table extend beyond participation in the game itself, frequently serving as teachers, introducing new players to the mechanics and social expectations, evaluators who assess competence and readiness, historians and scholars preserving stories and traditions, and cultural stewards who maintain the values and practices of the play community. We see Spades and the kitchen table as not just informal game spaces, not just passive sites of recreation, but active environments of cultural and knowledge production in the African American experience. Spades is a card game that holds cultural significance in African American culture and society. The experience, played at home, family gatherings, cookouts, school cafeterias, and anywhere with a group of people and a deck of cards, an expression of joy, banter, and belonging. To most scholars and writers and historians, we know that Spades evolved from British card games such as whist or bridge, that traveled to the Americas and was transferred to enslaved people, enslaved societies during the 19th century. In the South, the Cotton Belt, the enslaved people made bid with, subverting the games played by, or rather at the white kitchen table or in the white spaces. And at the turn of the 20th century, well after emancipation, and during the first wave of the Great Migration, the Southern diaspora settled in the urban North and spread through African American communities across the country. We see the origins originating in Cincinnati, Ohio, right across from the Ohio River, a significant place in terms of American history, and people who move throughout the country, popularized and spread by Pullman porters and returning Black veterans from World War II. While this game seems to be dominated or taken up by men in our collective imagination or what we see maybe in media, women always found ways to play. Scholars such as Tara Hunter, Stephanie Camp, Sadia Hartman, Amina McIntyre, those who work on Black women's histories and lives have recentered Black women's play and leisure as sites of resistance and autonomy. And so we join this conversation when we see the kitchen as a hush harbor, places where women who wish to engage in leisure and joy have a safe, unpoliced private space, and Spades would gain a seat at the table.
So then, of course, as we understand or begin to understand Spades as cultural practice, we also need to understand it really as a game system, right? So, of course, Spades formally is this kind of trick-taking game organized around hidden information, probability, right? And really this kind of iterative decision-making where players receive incomplete information through their hands or their bids, and then they execute strategies through play that's continuously updating their kind of understanding of the game state itself. And then, of course, additional information is revealed over time. So drawing on McIntry's discussion of Spades, the game can be then understood as this kind of four-player partnership card game centering on this kind of strategic prediction. Two teams of two players compete to win books or tricks right, with the objective of meeting or exceeding the number of tricks predicted during the bidding phase. So unlike many trick-taking games where the trump suit changes, Spades maintains this kind of consistent trump suit, with Spades functioning as this high-value cards that in turn just kind of override other suits during play. So then historically, scholars have connected Spades to these kind of earlier trick-taking traditions, some of which Marlene has mentioned earlier, right? So the English game of whist, and then also these other types of partnership-based games. So going further, McIntry notes that the histories of these prior card games provide important context for just understanding Spades as a part of this longer lineage of card games, while at the same time recognizing the specific cultural development within African American communities. So within Black American or rather African American play traditions, Spades really does just exist as this hybrid kind of practice that's one shaped by the earlier kind of games, but then also transformed through the community specific rules or even just the social meetings. So in this way, the game extends beyond its formal mechanisms through the kind of relationships and cultural practices that in turn are just developed around the table. So it's important to recognize that Spades also has traveled across the diasporic community, right? So then connecting all those different parts, Spade has this really broad history within this kind of global trick-taking tradition, but specifically within African American communities, it's really culturally situated around this kind of social connection, becoming inseparable with its elements of play. And one thing to note, of course, our argument is that Spades cannot just fully be understood through the mechanics alone, right? So we, of course, examine the formal game loop alongside the lived experiences of the players. And we see that the communication and also just the identity formation operating together and the interconnected forms all are essential to playing Spades. So in this way, bidding becomes this kind of probability calculation, but it also becomes this expression of confidence, of trusting the partnership of this cooperative strategy. It's really negotiating the kind of responsibility and accountability of all the players present, whether they're playing the actual game or not, right? So in this way, card games like Spades are not just systems of rules and the outcomes, right? But it's also the different cultural practices where mechanics become embedded within the actual social relationships formed around the table. So in this way, the mechanics create the structure of the game, but the community creates its meaning, essentially. And then, of course, when we examine Spades, it's important to talk about the kind of reward system, because as I was already kind of alluding to, there's this interesting kind of social aspect to it. So we see that games produce more than just the competitive outcomes, right? And sometimes traditional approaches often focus on these measurable rewards. So thinking about like points and victories, the conditions for which victory can even happen. However, when we situate Spades and we situate the play space at the kitchen table, the reward structures operate both as this kind of course, winning hand, right? But it's also just one form of achievement. Players are also working towards this kind of status symbol within the community. So this kind of belonging, the recognition, respect, the trust. So in this way, the game loop within Spades, once again, produces this kind of social knowledge. Every hand requires a player to do more than just calculate the possibilities and take some bids, right? They have to communicate to their partners. They have to negotiate the actual relationships at the table. So really the process of playing teaches participants, once again, whether they're actually in the play session or just even in the room, how to exist within a shared social environment. And then in this way, the gameplay isn't just limited to the interaction with the formal rules, right? It emerges through the interactions with the people who give those rules meaning. So for example, a player who may technically understand how to bid or execute a trick, but recognizes this kind of skilled player requires a deeper understanding of the social ecology of the table. So it's not just about winning, it's also about the social conditions. So players have to learn when to take risk, when to respond to their partners, how to like respond to the table and the room at large, and also essentially just how to maintain this kind of emotional rhythm of the game. So these forms of knowledge aren't just captured by the score alone. They're central to how the competence of everyone in the room is evaluated. So essentially, this kind of just reveals that Spades has this kind of dual reward system, right? The formal system, of course, rewarding successful bids, while the social system rewards confidence, recognition from other players. So a player doesn't simply win Spades by having a winning hand, they also build a reputation. So in this way, connecting it back to the previous slide, the game loop of Spades produces both skill acquisition and social status. At the kitchen table, the ultimate reward is not just victory, but it's becoming recognized as someone who belongs within the community of play. So then this leads us to thinking about green, right? So within Spades communities, the term green describes an inexperienced player who is entering into, once again, this kind of social ecology of the table for the first time. However, greenness doesn't necessarily need to be understood as this kind of fixed marker of incompetence or deficiency within Spades, right? Instead, it represents a transitional identity that emerges through the participation, observation, repeated engagement, mentorship, all of those like different social aspects that are defined within the play community. So then the green player occupies a kind of liminal position, right, between outsider and recognized participant, where they're simultaneously learning the formal mechanics of the game and then also just the informal social systems that shape belonging. So in this way, to be green is to enter a space where knowledge is acquired through doing. So new players have to learn more than just how to recognize like the card patterns. They must also develop this kind of embodied understanding of communication, of table etiquettes, right? So then their learning occurs through the interactions with these kind of models of boundaries and acceptable play. So then in this way, greenness becomes a kind of productive state of becoming rather than this kind of temporary failure to achieve expertise. And then, of course, connecting it back, Black women's play practices have historically been undervalued, underdocumented. And then when we think about the dominant narratives of games, especially around leisure and cultural production, this also rings true. So often within these kind of play spaces, they are usually relegated to a side, right? So everyday relational practices, domestic spaces where women have historically taught, or even sustained play cultures have been relegated to the side. So as a result, Black women's contributions to game practices are often rendered invisible, with their roles as educators or cultural producers rarely being recognized as these kind of forms of expertise.
Thank you. Spades operates as intergenerational knowledge through oral tradition, cultural gatekeeping, and observation. The kitchen table operates as play infrastructure, supporting as Spades as love, joy, community building. It is oral tradition, listening to the elders talking, laughing, sharing stories without talking over the boards. Spades is observation, young people, children, spectators standing around the table, watching the game, watching the players. If you are wise, you are silent. You watch the cards, hoping to catch the rhythms, the patterns, the mechanics, hoping that with enough study, you turn from green to red, like the hearts and diamonds, or black, like the clubs and spades. You definitely do not want to be the joker. Spades is cultural preservation, gatekeeping, playing around the kitchen table, passing down the knowledge spoken and unspoken keeps the culture alive. The visible and hidden transcripts. Shout out to James Scott. The subaltern, the ones who hide, the ones who play openly and share the things that outsiders miss. Exchange between generations, players, spectators. It's constant, it's visible and invisible, but it ensures that the traditions, practices, and lessons continue to exist over time and space.
So then when we examine Black women's play practices, it's important to consider what happens when these spaces aren't defined primarily through surveillance, right? Or even just labor. So then a central question becomes, what are Black women doing when they're not being observed through systems of control? What forms of creativity, pleasure, social power, strategy emerge when Black women occupy spaces designed around their own participation rather than this kind of external expectation? So then Elena Guzman's work on Black women's embodied spiritual and religious performances in Hades really helps us think about play as more than leisure. She describes these performances as a form of play labor that produces political power because they create opportunities to create dominant structures while also providing moments of escape or even just collective renewal from these different conditions of hardship. So then through these different playful performances, Black women challenge gendered and patriarchal expectations and really just create spaces where they can move beyond these kind of prescribed roles. And then similarly, Jillian Hernandez's concept of aesthetic excess examines how Black and Latina girls use this kind of creative expression to exceed past these dominant boundaries around kind of these acceptable forms of gender identity. So then Hernandez demonstrates that these practices aren't simply acts of self-expression, they're also extending into these different forms of agency. And then altogether, these scholars help us understand that play becomes a space where both Black women and girls imagine possibilities outside of these constraints. And applying this framework to Spades further helps us ask important questions about the social dynamics of the table, right? What changes when the room is composed of people who have shared cultural histories and understanding? How does the presence or even absence of certain observers alter what can be said? So then the kitchen table is really just this malleable space. It's meaning that shifts depending on who's present, who has authority, and who is allowed to participate.
I'm going to very quickly get through this because I think we have like a minute left, if that. So banter is essential to Spades to a point. You're not allowed to talk across the table, meaning giving your partner hints about your hand. But you find ways to communicate by playing the dozens, signifying, code switching, just talking or shh. The social dimensions of the game function not as interruptions to strategic decision making, but as mechanisms through which strategy is communicated and reinforced. So instead of saying, I got the ace of spades, you say, don't bring that weak shit over here. And those who know, know. If you know, you know. Banter is a performance, flipping what Big Willie Shake said, because the world could be a stage, but the world in this kitchen, the table is a stage. All of the men and the women are more than players, and at least one time that man or woman plays many parts. I'm gonna give it to Diamond to wrap it up.
Sure, so we're just gonna jump towards the end because I know we're short on time a little bit. Okay. So then, of course, our central argument, going back to the beginning, is that spades shouldn't just be understood as recreation, but also intertwined with cultural infrastructures. And of course, by infrastructures, we mean these kind of everyday systems and practices which communities help reproduce social knowledge and maintain connections and kind of sustain collective life across these different generations. So then this tells us that Spades functions as a game where people come together, that specific ways that we hold knowledge, the way that we structure knowledge, especially within places of refuge, are inherently important. And then as we situate this at the kitchen table, it allows for this malleability to form all across different generations, cultural values, diasporic kind of interactions with the game itself. And then once again thinking of Spades as this kind of collective way that we can sustain community, and then also think about our speculative futures through just the act of play. And then these are our references. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I'll have everyone that's presented come back on screen so that we can do Q&A. As I noted in Discord, Seattle, for some reason, I think I cursed myself, or we cursed ourselves with the internet problems, because Seattle never has thunderstorms, and it is thundering outside right now. And my Wi-Fi has gone out, like fully gone. So I'm on my phone's hotspot right now. So we will see how it goes. Thank you to all presenters. I think lots to think about. And I do really enjoy the sort of cross-identity play that's at work. I think all of your papers are in conversation with one another, especially thinking about the sort of question. I'm going to sort of zoom out from the, like, what happens at the kitchen table to what happens in games, and then who gets to be at the kitchen table to become who gets to even play the game, make the game, decide what a game should or shouldn't be. So if folks have questions, because of my Wi-Fi snafu, I haven't been paying attention. So if you ask questions in the chat, would you please just sort of bubble them back up to the surface, and or use the Q&A function in Zoom. And obviously, if panelists have conversations for one another, let's talk about it. So Marshall on Discord, we'll just start with, are Spades and Bid WISTs separate subcommunities? If you say play one or the other, does that say something about the communities of which you are a part? Does that make sense?
Can you repeat that? Sorry. Oh, no, you got this, Damon? Okay, good, good.
I'll put it in chat too.
Oh, so the difference between both forms of the game. So in a lot of our earlier research, there is a clear lineage between like Spades and Bid, but I think the difference is going back to like banter and how you like the social gameplay aspect. The way you interact with the people in the space inherently is kind of different. Yeah, Whist is this kind of trick-taking game, and it shows up in a lot of earlier, I guess, English literature and English play spaces. So there is an inherent difference based on how you play with the other people in the space. Some of the rules may be similar, but once again, adding that kind of social aspect really does change it. And then going to like the sub-communities question, it definitely does depend on who's all in the space. One reason we really liked using the kitchen table is because it's malleable, right? The space itself, it is shaped by who's in the room, no matter who's actually playing. So for instance, if I'm playing with like my aunts and uncles, that play space is going to be distinctly different than if I'm going to be with like some like other friends, right? So the dynamics change.
I think this is a question that, sort of runs through everybody's paper or presentation, is this notion of, and this is just coming off the top of my head, of when you play with a group that you have curated, or playing in a group that is monocultural, in the sense of like, I'm playing with my friends, or I'm playing with my family, or I'm playing with only queer people or only Asian people, as opposed to, going to the game store and sitting down at a table and pulling out our magic cards. What about that tension, I think, right? Because I think, especially riffing off of Mark's work, this idea that the far right or the libertarian or the racists and the fascists have really co-opted a lot of the language of social justice. And so they'll be like, well, that's gatekeeping, right? Like if you just play with only one group of people, whereas opposed to that's creating its own sort of safe space, right, in a particular way. Thoughts on that? So that could be race, it could be queerness, it could be online, it could be in the game store, however you want to talk about it, or even just alienness. Yeah.
I can take a crack because I think this is maybe directly related. Is there's a sense amongst the folks I was looking at that for a long time, their personal cultures of play were the same as those that were social or more public, right? That their public and private play lives overlapped entirely, that they could have similar discourses, strategies, and communities around their kitchen table as their local game store, at a convention, at wherever. And then through moments of cultural disruption, they begin to see the contingents of what has been the public sphere of play. They begin to see that it has been their privilege, right? Their historically constituted privilege that has allowed them to ignore the fact that the public has been built by them for them, right? So during those moments, perhaps of fracture, it becomes very interesting. I think what interests me most is their inability to do what people who have been marginalized from gaming communities for a variety of reasons across history have been able to do, which is to identify with, to play with, to engage with identities which are not their own. As soon as Aragorn turns black, they're like, this is no longer for me. When in reality, black players, Asian players, queer players have been playing with people who are unlike them for a variety of reasons for generations, right? And suddenly that is a moment of friction for them. I would be very interested to hear what the rest of you all thought, though.
Yeah, I think my tangent on that is to return to the idea of Magic the Gathering itself, or many other games. People talk about the Fortnitification of Magic, right? And these other IPs. Just thinking about games as platforms, you have this divide, which I think follows along a lot of the same lines. I've seen a lot of the discourse of free magic be about free magic from universes beyond, free it from, these exterior influences and keep it pure when in reality, if we look back at the original like Legends set, for instance, it's based on the creator's Dungeons and Dragons game, and that character that I showed, Tetsu Umezawa, is just this sort of like samurai insert because it's sweet to have samurai in your fantasy. And so yeah, to think about these things in a vacuum, I think serves that dominant supremacist narrative, as opposed to broadening out and realizing the variety of ways in which magic was never sort of its own thing, and to really bridge the gap here, I think that speaks to the broader panel in terms of these kind of like insular communities that form around protecting the purity of play, whereas we know sort of what that discourse stands for.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of want to follow up, and please jump in if let me strikes you. Like, it's interesting, kind of pulling on Yuri's paper. Like, what does it mean to play the other while you are the other versus playing the other while you are not the other, and the identity tourism that comes with that. So, and I think that's something to think about. So maybe think about that as well. I guess I'm just going to push on Cody just a little bit because the Asian American stuff really interests me, and I think this is really interesting. I mean, I guess how do you deal with, because I get this leveled at me sometimes where you know this is a game that's not necessarily made by Asian or Asian American people, artists or creators, and then throwing a samurai in because it's cool, is Orientalist in logic, And then at the same time, there are ways to read it as being more than just this sort of flat sort of critique. And so, what do you do with something that is both orientalizing and also doing really potentially interesting things with race or nationality or globalization?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think this is something that didn't come through so much in the presentation here for time. So I can say that playing more green to me means reckoning with the material ways in which your play is consumption, right? So you're talking about, a card company, or in this case, a toy company, Hasbro, which is making billions and billions of dollars off of what we can directly identify as like the plunder of the earth. Creating cardboard out of paper and shipping it around the world, and much of that ends up in landfills and so on and so on. And so thinking about it from the material standpoint helps me to reckon with that kind of duality, because both of those things are happening regardless. It depends on what you do with it. And one of the ways that I feel like players, people who are interested in interfacing with that platform, can kind of solve back for those bigger harms is to try and play in a way that is more one with our environment, for instance, right? Like take that lesson incredibly literally. To Mark's point, proxy cards, instead of purchasing them for exorbitant fees. Obviously, I want people to support their local game stores instead of buying sealed product from Wizards, right? Like those are the types of things that I think we can talk about on a one-to-one subjective level and say, here's what I can sort of do about this. Ed, your question, I think, is the question of my scholarly program right now, is like how to deal with that sort of tension between something that is orientalizing and something that is potentially liberatory. And I think it really does feel like existing on the knife's edge for me. My proclivity is to try to live more abundantly right now, and see that potential as being the thing to focus on more than the critique. I'm happy to argue about that, but I think that's where I'm finding a lot of productivity. And I guess the way that I would like fundamentally square the circle on that for myself is to say, even in spaces where there is sort of whiteness all around me, and I am like maybe holding the banner for green as Asian, it still feels like productive to have a conversation about that. I was at a local game store and I was talking to somebody about why I only ever play characters from Kamigawa and what that sort of means to me and how I might find representation in that. And I was surprised the level of depth that me and some random person drinking their Mountain Dew actually got to on just like a cold, rainy Thursday earlier this year. So that's a very long-winded answer, but that's the way that I kind of deal with those things. So I appreciate the space to open up about that. And I'd love to hear from other panelists about where you find yourselves.
Other thoughts? I'm trying to nudge the audience for questions. It's like class, right? It's like maybe Yuri, you could talk about again, maybe expand on this idea of the playing the other or playing aliens and the queer potential of that.
So this research dialogues with some topic of interest of mine. Here in Brazil, I am also developing research on Brazilian representation on games made by Brazilians. So it's a group of topics that are they are talking to each other. And for this conference, the idea of Alien came because of the green subject, right? And it expanded this idea of otherness and queerness inside the queer game studies theory, right? And I could observe some some game options. How can I say that? Okay. Some game design choices, but on creating this other space, and is by not representing in any way this alien character, the alien player. So I guess the most notable pattern that I found on the research was the story slash thematical representation of the alien, and by not putting the alien as a human, you don't have an appearance, right? So I guess it's a design choice to let more other people feel not represented, but to wear those shoes, right? And I can see this in other aspects, in other kind of games. And part of my research is also to investigate uh, anthropomorphic animals as also a way of um, letting people be the characters. So, and this is also something that makes me wonder if by creating games and creating characters that are animals or non-human at all, to make more people feel represented, or allow more people to play on with those characters, if this is not a way of also erasing representation, right? Because we are removing representation to let all kind of people feel feel comfortable, but we are removing specific representation and to to serve a majority. I don't know if I answer your question, but
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think one of the great things about, like, for example, reading novels, because I'm a literature professor, I always say, like, every time I teach Octavia Butler, for example, and her Xenogenesis trilogy, I often say, like, it's really important that it's really hard to imagine what the aliens look like. And that's purposeful, right? Because they are meant, what does it mean to experience true alienness, right? But so when you so but and that's the perils of any kind of visual representation, is that the minute you say, oh, this character looks like this, then we get into the race bending whitewashing problem, right? Because then people are like, nope, this character always must look like this, and then therefore they'll fight over that kind of representation. But you're absolutely right also, where if we just open the representation up to anything, then we lose some of the specificity that some of you are talking about and some of our previous panels are talking about, right? What does it look like to think about games or gameplay you know, from an African perspective versus from a global North perspective, or from a kitchen table perspective versus, the gaming store's perspective, or that sort of thing. I love all these table papers, and I feel like we need to, again, gather them together because I think they're really, really fascinating. I mean, the table's really important because it depends. Like, one of the things, I don't remember which year it was, where there was a presentation on gaming tables, right? The actual, like, physical thing, and game companies changing the dimensions of some of the things that they make. I mean, how many people, what are the IKEA shelves that everyone uses for board games now? It's Kallax or something like that. I don't remember the name. Um, um, but like, who has a table and a room, et cetera, to just dedicate to? I mean, that's my dream, but that requires a lot of space, effort, resources, and all those sorts of things. Other questions or concerns? Marlene or Beverly, have any additions to the convo as we go? You're like, we're good.
I tried answering Nick Copenhagen in the question and answer panel
Oh, okay.
asked Diamond and I a question, and I tried to write some answers, but yeah.
Oh, I don't see this.
So should I
Uh,
read the question out loud or no, no, maybe the host can. I'm sorry, my bad. I'm cool.
I could read it for you, Ed. It says, question to Diamond and Marlene. Can you speculate on
Oh,
what the implications might apply the social and cultural infrastructure lens to analog, digital, and sports games more broadly?
hmm.
So thank you, Cody. So what I basically said was that I play Spades on my phone. I played extensively in like solo play and multiplayer mode, and it followed the traditional, like in the game book version of Spades, not necessarily what we would say black spades are coded as black spades. So I remember telling my friend who's African American, she's like, yeah, but is it black spades? And it technically wasn't. So, for instance, in certain variations, you play the Joker as the trump as opposed to the ace of spades. So then it's big Joker, little Joker, then ace of spades, then descending. Sometimes the two of spades is the trump card. So it'd be two of spades, big Joker, little Joker, ace of spades, king of spades, and so on. There's also Boston if you play. So, um, oh God, I can't remember. I don't play Boston. This is why. So it's almost like playing Uno, where I remember it was on Threads or X Twitter, whatever it's called, where Uno's like this. These are the real rules, and everyone's like, Uno, shut up. You don't know how to play your own game. That's not how we play Uno, right? So, so in my case, especially, I'm Jamaican Canadian, right? I was born in Toronto. So I I learned spades from my English, one of my English relatives, not spades, bridge. And I remember, I learned going over there and they tried to keep me up because of jet lag and I wanted to die. I hate bridge to this day. It was a torture device. So I'm learning as an insider, outsider, as a on the peripheries, right? I'm a spectator. I'm taking notes. I'm learning even how to talk shit across the table, things like that, which is very important. These are the hidden transcripts. But living here for so long, I'm understanding the ways of playing, the verbal and nonverbal ways of communicating, and like I'm ready to go to any cookout. Like I used to play at school, but now I'm ready for, to beat the elders at their own game. Like I'm already rubbing my hands in anticipation, but yeah, so it definitely, extends to any medium, any spaces, digital or otherwise. It definitely depends on the context, the players who you're playing with, where you're playing and so forth. If you have a real deck with jokers in it, some people throw the jokers out as well. So
Yeah. Does the online version allow you to do any crosstalk or smack talk? Oh, cool. That's great.
it does definitely, and you can use like emojis and
Emojis.
things like that. But if you want to do
Mm.
like more violence, you have to pay for like the
Oh, there you
premium
go.
version.
You got to pay for violence.
Otherwise, yes.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for maybe really quickly this question from Brian. I'm interested in the potential intersection between marks and diamonds. Marlene's papers. Does our free magic represent a kind of dark mirror to the kitchen table, which is great? A space where the socializing functions of the kitchen table are turned towards radicalization, or instead represent something more akin to the kitchen table void, a blank space where the physical presence of being around a kitchen table with others is actually needed. You have 30-second hot take.
Big question. I can try to take a stab at it. one of the things that I really wanted to push against in the bigger project is I think Stuart Hall calls us being as perpetually in the problem of representation, of arguing over representation, that we have kicked out racism through the front door and it always sidles in the back window because we perpetually have to argue about these these kind of details. And I think what game studies feels uniquely suited to confronting is that problem, is how the structures of our world and the structures of our games allow us to unavoidably have to deal with this problem, the problem of race, a system for organizing people and setting them into hierarchies, right? And so I think like I don't know, maybe this is getting back to a generation analog in the past, but my impetus is to get to a place where we can flip or burn the table, perhaps, while still recognizing the deep value that the table has served historically, that I think Diamond and Marlene were gesturing towards, right? The table is a refuge, but we can't have the table also be a refuge for racism, sexism, violence. And so how to get to the point where we don't even need tables anymore? I don't know. That sounds weird now that I say it, but maybe it makes sense.
Yeah, or I mean, again, it's like it sounds like a them problem as opposed to an us problem, right? Like, why do we need to burn the table? Our table's fine. You all need to
Yes.
figure it out, right?
Yes. And I
Who?
think your point earlier, Ed, about them like appropriating the language of social justice, I think points
Yeah,
to this problem. Like the most fascinating thing about the data scraping is that the second or third most common co-locate for the word black was panther. It was panther,
mm,
Black Panther, because that equation, that switching, is them saying, what would they do if we had a white Black Panther instead of a dark-skinned Black Panther, right?
right,
This feels like an instantiation of the problem that I don't know if our language of
right.
visuality and representation is sufficient to overcome.
We do. We call him Captain America. So, I mean, anyway. Okay. On that note, mic drop. Thank you, presenters. One last round of hand of whatever it's called, applause. Let me go ahead and stop recording.